8 months pregnant. Jennifer stood shivering in the pouring rain because her millionaire husband threw her out to teach her a lesson. But what he never expected was who would show up and how that moment would change their lives forever. Before I begin the story, I'd like to say a quick prayer for you, my dear family. May your days be filled with peace, your heart with joy, and your steps guided by light. Amen. If you're happy to be here, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a story. Lightning carved jagged scars across the night sky, illuminating the sprawling mansion of Steven Wright like a haunted castle. Rain poured in sheets, hammering the marble steps of the grand entrance, washing away the warmth of the summer day. The storm was fierce, merciless, almost as though the heavens themselves mirrored the chaos within Jennifer Wright's heart. She stood there on the stone porch, shivering beneath the weight of the downpour. Her dress clung to her swollen belly, the fabric plastered against her 8-month pregnancy. One hand cradled her stomach instinctively. The other reached for the brass handle of the door that had just slammed shut in her face. Jennifer's chest heaved with disbelief. He really did it. He locked me out. Behind that door was her husband, the man she had loved since she was 21, Steven Wright, the charismatic millionaire whose smile had once melted her defenses. Tonight, his smile was nowhere to be seen. His voice, cold and clipped, still echoed in her mind. You need to learn, Jennifer. You don't talk back to me. Maybe the rain will teach you some humility. She pressed her forehead against the door, rain and tears mingling freely now. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Steven, please, I'm carrying your child." No answer. The silence from inside the mansion was louder than the thunder crashing above. Jennifer staggered back a step, her body trembling from both the cold and the ache in her heart. How had they come to this? Once, Steven had held her like she was the rarest gem on earth. Once, he had whispered promises of protection, devotion, forever. But wealth had changed him. Success had carved something sharp into his soul. Arrogance, entitlement, cruelty dressed in expensive suits. Now here she was, the mother of his unborn child, left to shiver on marble steps as punishment for daring to speak her mind. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the sting of every raindrop like needles on her skin. Her thoughts drifted to the little heartbeat inside her, the innocent life that kicked gently as if sensing her distress. "I'm sorry, baby," she whispered. "Mommy's trying." Lightning flashed again, and in its brief light she saw her reflection in the massive glass doors. Pale face framed by soaked hair, eyes wide with betrayal, lips blue from the cold. She hardly recognized the woman staring back at her. She remembered the argument. It had been about something so small. Dinner. A simple dinner. She had asked Steven to spend the evening with her, to stay home instead of attending yet another business gala. She had wanted just one quiet night, one meal shared with laughter, one moment to feel like they were still a family. But Steven had scoffed. "I can't afford to play house when deals worth millions are on the table. Do you think this life funds itself, Jennifer?" Her voice had cracked as she tried to explain. "I don't care about the money. I just need you." He had snapped. The fight escalated. Then the punishment came, the storm, the slammed door, the rain soaking her through. Now, as she stood outside, lightning flashing and thunder shaking the ground, Jennifer realized this was not just about dinner. This was about control, power, a test of how much she could endure before she broke. Her legs wobbled beneath her. She sank onto the cold steps, the stone leaching away what little warmth remained in her body. A sob tore through her chest, but she muffled it quickly, pressing her hand over her mouth. She didn't want the staff to hear. She didn't want anyone to know how far she had fallen. But someone did hear. From the shadowed driveway, a figure moved, tall, broad-shouldered, steady even against the storm. The headlights of a black SUV flickered off, and the door slammed shut with quiet finality. Boots splashed through puddles as the man approached, his posture protective, alert. "Mrs. Wright?" Jennifer lifted her head weakly, blinking through the rain. Relief and shame collided in her chest as she recognized him. It was Daniel Cole, Steven's head of security, her bodyguard. His dark trench coat was already soaked, but he didn't seem to care. His gaze, sharp and assessing, swept over her trembling form. The wet strands of hair stuck to her face, the way her arms curled protectively around her swollen belly. A flash of something passed through his eyes. Anger, quickly buried beneath his professional calm. "My God," he muttered under his breath, crouching in front of her. "You're freezing." Jennifer shook her head weakly. "Daniel, please go back inside. This is between me and Steven." But Daniel didn't move. His jaw tightened, his voice firm yet gentle. "With respect, ma'am, this stopped being private the moment he left you out here like this." She closed her eyes, tears spilling despite her will. The shame of being seen in her brokenness cut deeper than the cold. He said, "I had to learn. I shouldn't have." "No," Daniel interrupted, his tone low, steady, unshakable. "You shouldn't be apologizing. Not for wanting your husband to care." The words pierced through her, cracking something in her chest. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw no judgment, no pity, just sincerity. He shrugged off his coat and draped it around her shoulders, tucking it carefully around her belly. The warmth of it was immediate, though his hand, brushing against hers, radiated more comfort than the fabric ever could. Jennifer's lips quivered. "If Steven sees you, let him," Daniel said simply, his gaze hardening as though daring anyone, even Steven Wright, to challenge him. For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the relentless rain. Then Daniel spoke again, softer this time, almost like a vow. "You're not alone, Mrs. Wright. Not tonight. Not ever if I can help it." Her throat tightened. Something unspoken flickered in her chest. Gratitude. Yes, but also something dangerous. Something that stirred beneath the surface of her grief. From inside the mansion, a shadow moved behind the curtains of an upstairs window. Steven Wright, drink in hand, watched silently as his wife leaned into the bodyguard's protection. His jaw clenched, his pride searing like fire. He had meant to teach her a lesson, but as he stood there unseen, it was Steven who felt the first sting of unease, the faint, unwelcome thought that perhaps he had underestimated the cost of his cruelty. Years before the rain-soaked night when Jennifer Wright sat shivering on marble steps, there had been sunshine. Jennifer could still remember the first time she met Steven Wright. It wasn't at some glittering gala or across the polished floors of a business empire. It was in a coffee shop on a windy afternoon when she was 21 and broke, her textbooks spilling across the floor because she tried to carry too many at once. "Careful there," a warm voice had said, accompanied by the quick shuffle of shoes. She looked up to see a tall young man crouching down, gathering her books with surprising gentleness. His suit had looked too expensive for the chip tables and squeaky chairs of the coffee shop, but his smile had been boyish, disarming. "You look like you're preparing to single-handedly take on every library in the city," he teased, stacking the books into her arms again. Jennifer laughed nervously. "It's called being a full-time student and part-time tutor. Not as glamorous as it looks." Something flickered in his eyes then. Curiosity. "What are you studying?" "Education. I want to teach English. Literature mostly." He had tilted his head as though filing the information away. "A woman who loves words. That's rare." "And you?" she asked, brushing her hair out of her eyes. "Business," he replied. "But don't hold that against me." She smiled, and something about the way he looked at her, like she was the only person in the world at that moment, sent a flutter through her chest. That was Steven Wright before the world crowned him a millionaire. Before Forbes covers and Wall Street whispers, he was charming, magnetic, and beneath all the ambition, attentive in ways that made Jennifer believe in forever. They began meeting after her classes, long walks across campus, dinners at little diners where the menus were laminated and the coffee always lukewarm. He listened to her talk about her dreams of a classroom full of bright-eyed kids, about the books she wanted to teach, about the difference she hoped to make. And he told her about his childhood, growing up with very little, watching his father lose job after job, watching his mother stretch every dollar until it snapped. "I promised myself I'd never live like that," he had said one night, staring at the city skyline. "One day, I'll be the man nobody can ignore." Jennifer, young and idealistic, had reached for his hand and whispered, "You already are." He kissed her then, under the city lights, and she believed she had found her forever. The proposal came fast. A year later, on her 22nd birthday, Steven rented out the rooftop of the very coffee shop where they had met, transforming it with fairy lights and roses. He got down on one knee, a diamond catching the glow of the city, and asked her to be his wife. She cried. She said yes. They danced under the stars, and for a moment, it was a love story straight out of the books she adored. But fairy tales, Jennifer would later realize, often skip over the after. Marriage to Steven was not what she had imagined. At first it was sweet, dinners together, whispered promises, mornings tangled in bedsheets. But as his business grew, as his empire expanded, so did the distance between them. Steven's ambition was a fire that consumed everything in its path. Deals, meetings, late nights, power lunches. Jennifer became more of an accessory than a partner, someone to stand by his side at galas, smiling as he charmed investors. The first time he dismissed her voice in public, she told herself it was stress. The second time, she told herself it was pressure. By the 10th time, she stopped making excuses. She remembered one particular evening, a charity dinner hosted in a ballroom, glittering with chandeliers. She had leaned close, whispering that maybe they could leave early, spend some time together. He had chuckled under his breath and replied, "Jennifer, don't embarrass me. These people are worth more than your feelings." The words had sliced through her like a blade. Later that night, she had cried quietly in the bathroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She had almost left him then, but love, and the memory of the man he used to be, kept her anchored. The pregnancy had changed everything and nothing at all. When she told Steven she was carrying his child, his reaction was not the joy she had hoped for. He had smiled, yes, but it was the tight smile of a man thinking of legacy, not love. A son, he had murmured, already certain. Someone to inherit the empire. Wright Industries will stay in the family. Jennifer had laughed softly, touching her belly. Or her daughter, Steven. Either way, it's our baby. He had kissed her forehead, distracted. Of course. But you'll need to be careful, Jennifer. No stress. No public appearances without my approval. I can't have you ruining our image. That was when she realized she was not a wife carrying a child. She was a vessel carrying an heir. Still, she clung to hope. She decorated the nursery herself, painting stars on the ceiling, folding tiny clothes into drawers. She sang lullabies to her belly when Steven was away. She told herself that maybe, just maybe, holding their child would soften him, remind him of the boy she met in that coffee shop. But Steven's lessons became harsher as her pregnancy progressed. Every disagreement was a challenge to his authority. Every tear she shed was weakness in his eyes. He began to use silence as punishment, absence as discipline. And when silence and absence weren't enough, he resorted to cruelty, the sharp sting of words that cut deeper than any blade. You're too emotional. You don't understand business. You should be grateful for the life I've given you. She endured it all for the sake of the little life inside her. And then came that night. The night when her simple request, one dinner, one evening of his time, had turned into war. "I'm not asking for the world, Steven," she had pleaded, her voice trembling. "I'm asking for one meal. Just us. No investor, no contracts, no deals." He had laughed bitterly, pouring himself another glass of whiskey. "You still don't get it, do you? This life doesn't stop because you're lonely. Do you think I built all of this by sitting at home eating dinner with you?" Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't care about this life. I care about you." His jaw clenched, his pride bristled, and then he delivered the words that would echo in her mind as the rain drenched her hours later. "You need to learn, Jennifer. You don't talk back to me. Maybe the rain will teach you some humility." He had opened the door, gesturing coldly. She had thought, for a split second, that he was leaving. Instead, he had turned his gaze on her, unyielding, commanding. Out. Her heart had cracked then, but she obeyed, because part of her still believed that if she endured enough, if she proved her loyalty, the man she once knew would return. As Jennifer sat in the rain that night, her soaked dress clinging to her body, the memory of those early days, laughter over spilled textbooks, kisses under city lights, tormented her. She still loved him. God help her. She still loved him. But for the first time, she wondered if love was enough. Meanwhile, in the study upstairs, Steven Wright watched from a window. The drink in his hand burned, but not as much as the sight below. His wife, huddled under the protection of another man, his employee. His jaw tightened, his grip on the glass so firm he thought it might shatter. It was supposed to be a lesson, a reminder that she needed him, that without him she was vulnerable. But the look in her eyes as Daniel draped his coat over her shoulders, it wasn't weakness. It was something else. Steven turned away sharply, the storm outside no louder than the storm inside his chest. He told himself it didn't matter. She was his wife, his property, and property, once claimed, always returned. But deep down in the part of him he refused to acknowledge, a seed of fear had been planted. A fear that maybe, just maybe, the lesson was backfiring. The storm did not ease. If anything, it raged fiercer, as though the heavens themselves refused to grant Steven Wright's cruelty the dignity of silence. Jennifer sat shivering on the marble steps, Daniel's coat draped around her, its weight and warmth the only shield she had against the cold. Her teeth chattered as her body trembled. But inside her chest something heavier churned, shame, sorrow, and an ache too deep to name. Daniel crouched before her, steady despite the wind whipping rain across his face. His voice was calm, deliberate, each word carrying the certainty of a man trained never to falter. "You can't stay out here, Mrs. Wright. Not in your condition." Jennifer shook her head, rain-drenched curls clinging to her cheeks. "If I leave now, he'll think he's won. He'll say I disobeyed him." Daniel's jaw tightened. He had served as Steven Wright's head of security for 3 years. In that time, he had seen power plays, manipulation, even cruelty. But never had he imagined Steven would go this far. Not to his own wife. Not to the mother of his child. "This isn't obedience," Daniel said firmly. "This is endangerment. You're carrying his child, for God's sake." Her lips trembled. "He doesn't see it that way. To him, a failing. Weak. Too needy." Daniel's eyes softened, the steel in them dimming for just a moment. "You're not weak, Jennifer." The use of her first name startled her. He had never crossed that line before. She looked at him, rain sliding down both their faces, and for a moment she saw not just a bodyguard, but a man whose loyalty went deeper than a paycheck. "Daniel," her voice cracked, fragile and uncertain. He shook his head, as though cutting her doubts in half. "I made a vow when I took this job, to protect you, not just from strangers, but from anything that threatens your safety, even if that threat is standing inside that mansion." The words hit her like a wave. She wanted to protest, to say that Steven wasn't a threat, that he was just misguided. But the bruise on her heart told a different story. A roll of thunder shook the ground, and Daniel stood, extending his hand. "Come, there's a car ready. You can dry off, warm up. We'll figure out the rest later." Jennifer hesitated, staring at the hand before her. Taking it would mean defiance. Taking it would mean choosing her dignity over her husband's control. And yet she took it. Daniel pulled her to her feet with careful strength, his hand steadying her as her knees wobbled beneath the weight of exhaustion and pregnancy. He guided her down the steps, shielding her from the rain with his own body as they crossed the slick driveway to the waiting SUV. Inside, the leather seats smelled faintly of cedar and rain. The heat roared to life as Daniel draped a dry blanket over her shoulders. Jennifer sank into the seat, her hands trembling as she pressed them against her belly. "Is the baby?" Daniel began. She nodded weakly. Still moving, still strong. Relief flashed across his face, followed by a hardening of his jaw. He started the engine, his eyes flicking to the mansion where Steven remained unseen behind closed curtains. For a long moment, Daniel simply stared, the muscle in his cheek ticking. Finally he muttered, "I've guarded presidents, CEOs, even royalty. But tonight, I've never seen anything as disgraceful as this." Jennifer swallowed hard. He wasn't always like this. Daniel glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Maybe not, but a man shows his truth when power is in his hands. The words stung not because they were cruel, but because they echoed her own fears. As the SUV rolled away from the mansion, Jennifer leaned her head against the window, watching raindrops chase each other down the glass. In her chest, two emotions warred violently: shame that she had needed saving, and a fragile relief that someone had cared enough to offer it. Upstairs, Steven Wright set his glass down with a sharp clink. He had watched it all. The bodyguard's coat over Jennifer's shoulders, his hand steadying her as she walked, the way she had leaned into him, as though trusting him with her very life. His blood boiled. It was supposed to be a lesson, a punishment. She was supposed to beg to come back inside, humbled and repentant. Instead, she had chosen another man's hand over his. Steven paced the length of his study, thunder echoing his fury. Daniel Cole, a man he had hired, paid, trusted with his wife's safety. And now, he dared to undermine his authority? No, this would not stand. He pressed his palms against the desk, leaning forward, his reflection glaring back at him from the polished wood. For the first time in years, an unfamiliar sensation tightened his chest. Jealousy. He hated it. He hated that it burned hotter than the whiskey in his veins. He hated that he cared. Because if Jennifer could find comfort in another man's arms, even for a single night, then perhaps she wasn't as bound to him as he thought. And that possibility terrified him more than he would ever admit. Daniel drove Jennifer to a quiet townhouse just outside the city. His own. It was modest compared to the Wright mansion, but it radiated something the mansion never did: warmth. He opened the door, guiding her inside with gentle care. The living room was simple: a soft couch, shelves lined with old books, a framed photograph of his late father in military uniform. "Sit," Daniel instructed softly, helping her lower herself onto the couch. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a towel, kneeling to gently dry her hair. Jennifer's throat tightened. No one had tended to her with such tenderness in months, maybe years. The contrast was unbearable. "You don't have to," she began, but he cut her off. "Yes, I do." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. A recognition, an understanding. Jennifer closed her eyes, letting the silence wrap around them. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to rest, her hand protectively cradling her belly as sleep pulled her under. Daniel watched her breathing steady, the rise and fall of her chest calming the storm in his own heart. He should not feel this way. He was a protector, not a savior. Bound by duty, not desire. And yet, seeing her abandoned, drenched, trembling, something inside him had shifted. He stood, turning off the lamp, but not before murmuring to the sleeping woman on his couch. "No one will ever hurt you again. Not while I'm here." Back at the mansion, Steven lay awake in the massive bed that suddenly felt far too empty. His fists clenched the sheets, his mind replaying the image of Jennifer leaning into Daniel's coat. He told himself he was angry because of the betrayal, because an employee had overstepped, because his wife had dared defy him. But deep down, in the dark corners of his heart, Steven Wright felt something he had not felt in years. Fear. Morning came gently in Daniel's townhouse, the storm outside having passed in the night. Sunlight streamed through thin curtains, painting golden streaks across the modest living room. Jennifer stirred awake, the faint scent of coffee drifting from the kitchen. For a moment, she forgot where she was. She wasn't in the cavernous, cold master bedroom of the Wright mansion. She wasn't listening for footsteps, waiting for Steven's mood to dictate whether the day would begin in silence or scorn. She was wrapped in a warm blanket, lying on a couch that felt lived in. There were faint scuffs on the wooden floor, books stacked neatly but not obsessively, and the steady hum of life that Steven's perfectionist mansion lacked. And in the kitchen stood Daniel, dressed simply in a gray t-shirt and jeans, pouring coffee with the ease of a man who lived in rhythm, not spectacle. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm, grounding. Jennifer sat up slowly, one hand instinctively pressing to her belly. "I must have fallen asleep." "You needed it," Daniel replied, setting a steaming mug on the table beside her. "You were exhausted." She hesitated, glancing at the cup. "Steven doesn't like me drinking coffee. He says it makes me anxious." Daniel's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, quiet disapproval. "This is decaf. Relax." She managed a small smile, her chest warming in a way that had nothing to do with the drink. "Thank you." For a while, silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Jennifer sipped, savoring the small act of being considered. Every gesture Daniel made seemed deliberate, not grand, not loud, but thoughtful. It reminded her painfully of a time when Steven had been like that too. Back at the mansion, Steven Wright sat in his study, bleary-eyed and restless. The storm had left puddles across the estate grounds, their reflections shimmering like accusations. He hadn't slept. He kept replaying the same images. Jennifer stepping into Daniel's car, Jennifer leaning against him, Jennifer leaving him. He tried to drown the thoughts in whiskey, but they lingered, gnawing at the edges of his pride. By mid-morning, his chief of staff entered the study with a folder of reports. "Sir, the investors are asking for confirmation about the London expansion. They need your—" "Leave it," Steven snapped, waving him off. The staffer froze, unused to such dismissal. Steven was a man of order, precision, efficiency. But now his desk was cluttered with untouched papers. His tie was undone, his hair mussed. "Sir, did you hear me? I said leave it." The man stammered, nodded quickly, and left, the heavy door shutting behind him. Steven pressed his palms against his temples, trying to silence the unfamiliar chaos in his mind. Business had always been his anchor. Deals, contracts, numbers, they never lied. But Jennifer's absence had shifted something inside him, and the empire that once felt unshakable suddenly seemed fragile. At Daniel's townhouse, Jennifer sat by the window, watching children play in the narrow street below. Their laughter floated upward, piercing the quiet. Her hand drifted across her belly. "I used to imagine. When Steven and I first talked about a family, I thought it would be different. I thought he'd be here for moments like these. That he'd—" She trailed off, unable to finish. Daniel, sitting across the room, leaned forward. "What did you imagine?" Her throat tightened. That he'd read bedtime stories, hold our baby when she cried. That he'd be the man I fell in love with again. Daniel studied her quietly. And now, Jennifer blinked back tears. Now I'm not sure he's capable of love at all. Daniel's jaw flexed, his silence heavy. He wanted to tell her she deserved more than indifference, more than cruelty. But the words lodged in his throat, bound by his role, by the invisible lines he refused to cross. Instead, he said softly, "Sometimes people lose themselves in the chase for power. They forget what matters until it's too late." Jennifer's eyes lifted to his, searching, vulnerable. "Do you think it's too late for Steven?" Daniel hesitated. "That depends on whether he's willing to face himself. And men like Steve rarely do." Her breath hitched, and for the first time, she voiced a thought that had haunted her for months. "What if my child grows up without a father's love?" Daniel's chest tightened. He wanted to promise her it wouldn't happen. But promises like that weren't his to make. Instead, he said what he could. "Then your child will grow up with a mother's strength. And maybe that will be enough." Steven spent the day pacing the mansion like a caged animal. The silence of the house pressed down on him, oppressive in a way he had never noticed before. Jennifer's absence was not just physical, it was spiritual. Her laughter, her soft humming, even her footsteps. They had been the lifeblood of this house, and now, without them, it was a mausoleum. By evening, he couldn't stand it anymore. He grabbed his phone and dialed. "Mr. Wright," came a cold, professional voice of his head of security. "Where is she?" Steven demanded. There was a pause. "Sir, don't play games with me." "Jennifer, where is she?" Another pause, then reluctantly. "She's safe. With Daniel." The words slammed into Steven like a physical blow. His grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles whitened. "With Daniel?" he hissed. "Yes, sir." Steven ended the call before he could hear more. His chest burned, his pride howling in protest. Jennifer had chosen safety with another man, and yet, beneath the fury, another truth pulsed, unwelcome and undeniable. She had not been safe with him. The realization unsettled him more than the jealousy. That night, Jennifer stood on Daniel's small balcony, the city lights glowing in the distance. She wrapped her arms around herself, her thoughts heavy. Steven's face haunted her, the boy she had loved, the man he had become, the husband who had abandoned her in the rain. She whispered into the night, as though speaking to herself. "How do you forgive someone who keeps breaking the same pieces of you?" Daniel, stepping onto the balcony behind her, heard the question but did not answer. Some questions, he knew, were not meant for him. He simply stood beside her, silent and steady. A quiet reminder that even in her darkest moments, she was not alone. And for Jennifer, that was enough. For now, back at the mansion, Steven poured himself another drink, but it tasted bitter. He set it down untouched, staring at the stormy reflection in the glass. For the first time in his life, Steven Wright wondered if winning had cost him everything worth having. Steven Wright had always been a man who controlled the narrative. In boardrooms, in negotiations, even in his own home. His voice was the one that carried weight. His word the one that ended all arguments. But tonight, as his black Bentley pulled up in front of Daniel's modest townhouse, Steven felt something unfamiliar clawing at his chest. Not rage, though there was plenty of that simmering beneath the skin. Not even humiliation. It was fear. The thought had gnawed at him all day. What if she doesn't want to come back? What if she's happier without me? The headlights swept across the narrow street, illuminating Daniel's car parked neatly by the curb. Steven's fists clenched on the steering wheel. He could already picture it. Jennifer sitting inside, laughing with him, finding comfort where her husband had failed to give it. He killed the engine, stepped out, and adjusted his jacket with the practiced precision of a man who believed appearances were armor. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement as he approached the door. For the first time in years, he knocked. Jennifer was in the living room, folding the blanket she'd slept under, when the sound froze her in place. A knock. Firm, sharp, commanding. Her breath caught. She knew that rhythm. Daniel appeared from the kitchen, drying his hands on a towel. One look at her face, and he understood. His jaw tightened. "Do you want me to get it?" he asked quietly. Jennifer hesitated. Her heart pounded, not just from fear, but from the unresolved ache of loving and hating Steven in equal measure. She nodded. Daniel crossed to the door, opened it, and found himself face to face with Steven Wright. The two men locked eyes. One a titan of wealth and power, his presence commanding even in silence. The other steady and grounded, a quiet strength radiating without pretense. "Mr. Wright," Daniel said flatly. Steven's gaze swept over him, cold and assessing. "Step aside." Daniel didn't move. "Jennifer is safe here." "I didn't ask if she was safe." Steven's tone was icy. "I asked you to step aside." For a long, taut moment, neither man moved. Then a voice broke the tension. "Steven." Jennifer's voice. Soft but firm. Steven's head snapped toward her. She stood just beyond the doorway, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. Her eyes, tired, wary but resolute, met his. Something shifted in his chest at the sight. For a brief flicker of a moment, his anger faltered. "Jennifer," he breathed. She stepped forward slowly, her heart thundering. "What are you doing here?" "I came to bring you home," Steven said. His voice, once so certain, carried a faint edge of desperation. Jennifer swallowed hard. "Home?" Her laugh was soft, bitter. "You mean the mansion where you left me standing in the rain like a stray dog? That home?" Steven flinched. It was the first time she had ever spoken to him with such sharpness. Daniel remained at the doorway, his broad frame a silent barrier. He didn't speak, didn't move, but his presence alone made Steven bristle. "This isn't you, Jennifer," Steven said, his voice hardening. "You're emotional, you're pregnant," she cut in. "Abandoned? Humiliated? Which word are you searching for, Steven?" Her words sliced through the night air. Steven's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged, least of all by her. Yet here she was, no longer shrinking beneath the shadow. "You're my wife," he said finally, as though that single word should erase everything. Jennifer shook her head, tears burning in her eyes. "Your wife, not your possession, not your lesson to teach. I am carrying your child, Steven, and you left us out there in the storm. Do you even understand what you did?" The silence that followed was deafening. Steven opened his mouth to respond, but the words tangled in his throat. He wanted to say he regretted it, that he had been angry, that he hadn't thought, but excuses felt hollow against the truth standing before him. Daniel spoke quietly, but his voice carried weight. "Mr. Wright, Jennifer doesn't need control. She needs care. If you can't give her that, don't stand in the way of someone who will." Steven's head snapped toward him, fury sparking in his eyes. "And you think that's you?" Daniel's expression didn't change. "I think anyone who respects her could do better than what you did." The words landed like a slap. Steven's pride roared, demanding he strike back. But when his gaze returned to Jennifer, he saw not just her tears, but her strength. She wasn't looking at him like a savior. She wasn't begging. She was choosing. And for the first time, Steven realized he might not be the one she chose. Jennifer's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Steven, go home." He stared at her, stunned. "What?" "Go home," she repeated, her eyes hard. "I need time. Time to think. Time to breathe. And if you can't give me that, then maybe you don't belong in my future at all." The finality in her tone left no room for argument. Steven's chest tightened painfully, a foreign sensation clawing at him. Rejection. He had built empires, commanded respect, crushed competition. But in this small townhouse, he stood powerless. For a moment, his gaze flicked to Daniel, and something dark flared within him. But then he looked back at Jennifer, and all that remained was the raw ache of a man realizing he had broken something he might never fix. His voice was low, almost broken. "Jennifer." But she turned away, her hand brushing her belly. A silent dismissal. Steven lingered at the threshold, pride and love warring inside him, before finally stepping back. Without another word, he turned and walked toward his car. From a window, Jennifer watched as the Bentley's taillights disappeared into the night. Her heart felt heavy, but also strangely lighter. For the first time, she had stood her ground. Daniel approached quietly. "You okay?" She nodded slowly, though her voice trembled. "For the first time in a long time, I think I am." And in the shadows of the night, as Steven drove back to his empty mansion, the cracks in his empire widened. For the first time in his life, Steven Wright understood what it meant to lose. Jennifer had never realized how quiet freedom could be. For years, her life had moved to the rhythm of Steven's demands. The ringing of his phone, the slam of doors, the clipped tone of his orders. But here, in Daniel's modest home, the silence was hers. She woke when her body told her to, not when footsteps echoed down the marble halls. She ate when she felt hungry, not when a clock dictated dinner. And in the evening, she sat by the window with a book, her hand resting gently on the life growing inside her. It wasn't luxury, it wasn't grandeur, but it was peace. Daniel respected that peace. He didn't hover. He didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. He was simply there, a steady presence, a quiet protector. One morning, Jennifer found a bouquet of simple daisies in a chipped vase on the kitchen table. No note, no explanation. When she glanced at Daniel, he only shrugged. They looked like they belonged here. She smiled for the first time in weeks. Meanwhile, in the mansion that had once felt untouchable, Steven Wright unraveled. The house was silent without Jennifer, but not the kind of silence that brought peace. This silence was suffocating, accusatory, every empty room echoing with absence. He tried to bury himself in work, but his mind betrayed him. In meetings, his eyes drifted to the door, half expecting her to walk in. On conference calls, he lost track of numbers, distracted by memories of her laughter. The man who once terrified competitors now looked hollow-eyed, his sharp edges dulled by regret. At night, he sat in Jennifer's empty dressing room, staring at her untouched clothes. Her scent lingered faintly on silk scarves. Her handwriting still marked the edges of recipe books. He ran his hands over them, desperate to hold on to what he had pushed away. "Why did I do it?" he whispered into the emptiness. The rain had long since dried, but the image of Jennifer standing in it, hand on her belly, burned in his mind. It haunted him more than any failed deal, more than any lost fortune. For the first time in his life, Steven admitted the truth. He was terrified. Terrified that he had gone too far. Jennifer's strength grew day by day. She visited the doctor's office with Daniel by her side, his steady hand ensuring she didn't slip on the stairs. She began journaling again, her words pouring out with a freedom she hadn't felt in years. And slowly, she began to rediscover herself. One evening, she stood before the mirror, studying her reflection. Her face looked tired, but her eyes had fire again. "You're not weak," she whispered to herself. "Not anymore." The words weren't for Steven. They were for her. Steven's spiral deepened. At a charity gala, he arrived late, his usual commanding presence replaced with distracted glances and curt answers. Reporters whispered, noting the absence of his wife. Investors frowned, sensing instability in the man who had once seemed unshakable. In the corner of the glittering ballroom, Steven caught his reflection in a mirrored column. For the first time, he didn't recognize the man staring back. A man alone. A man who had built everything, and yet had nothing. That night, he returned to the mansion and poured himself a drink. But the taste turned to ash in his mouth. He slammed the glass down, shattering it across the marble floor. Breathing heavily, he staggered to the balcony, gripping the railing until his knuckles turned white. The city sprawled beneath him, glittering with wealth, ambition, power. All the things he had once believed defined him. But none of it mattered. Not without Jennifer. Not without the child he had already failed. His voice broke into the night. "I don't know how to fix this." The words hung in the air, swallowed by the vast emptiness. For the first time in his life, Steven Wright, the man who thought he could buy, command, or control anything, realized he was powerless. Jennifer sat by Daniel's window that same night, the faint glow of a lamp illuminating her journal. She wrote of fear, of betrayal, but also of hope. Her hand lingered on one sentence. What if Steven changes? What if love can be reborn? She closed the journal slowly, her heart torn between past and present, between the man who had broken her and the man who now guarded her. But deep down, a whisper echoed, a whisper she wasn't ready to admit aloud. She still loved Steven, broken, bitter, bruised. But love doesn't vanish easily. And somewhere across the city, in the depths of his despair, Steven whispered her name into the silence. Jennifer. A plea, a prayer, a man at his lowest, reaching for the woman who had once been his light. Steven Wright had never apologized to anyone in his life. Not to competitors, not to investors, not even to employees he had steamrolled to build his empire. Apologies were weakness. That's what his father had taught him. But as he sat in his darkened study, staring at the half-written letter before him, Steven realized he had no idea how to even begin. The words wouldn't come. "I'm sorry" felt too small for the wound he had inflicted. "Please come home" sounded like another demand, another command from a man who only knew how to issue orders. He tore the paper in half, tossed it into the fireplace, and buried his head in his hands. Across town, Jennifer stood in front of a small boutique, running her fingers over a tiny dress displayed in the window. Pale yellow, soft fabric, delicate lace along the edges. Her eyes blurred with tears. She pictured her baby in it, tiny fists waving, eyes wide with innocence. For a moment, she felt a pang. This was a moment she had once dreamed of sharing with Steven. A day of laughter, of choosing names, of building a nursery together. But that dream had drowned in the rain the night he left her. "Do you like it?" Daniel's voice was quiet beside her. She blinked and turned to him, realizing he had followed her gaze. "Yes," she admitted softly, "but I don't need it yet." Daniel's lips curved into the faintest smile. Sometimes it helps to see the future, to remember there's more waiting than just the pain. Her throat tightened. He was right, but the ache of what she had lost pressed heavily against her chest. Back at the mansion, Steven's spiral had not gone unnoticed. Clara, his secretary of nearly a decade, entered his office one morning with a folder of documents. She paused when she saw him sitting slumped at his desk, the glow of his computer screen reflecting the weariness etched into his face. "Steven," she said gently, the rare use of his first name startling him. "You look different." He raised his head slowly. "Different? Human," she said. His jaw clenched. "I don't have time for—" "Yes, you do." Her tone sharpened, cutting through his protest. "You've built this empire from nothing, but you're about to lose the only thing that matters. And if you don't face yourself, you will lose her." Her bluntness stunned him. Clara had always been loyal, professional, unwavering. But now she looked at him not as an employee, but as someone who had watched him destroy himself piece by piece. Steven swallowed hard. "What am I supposed to do?" "Something you've never done before," she said simply. "Listen." The word felt foreign, almost insulting. but it lingered long after she left, echoing in the empty office. Jennifer spent her days in Daniel's home, slowly learning to stand on her own again. She cooked simple meals, hummed softly to her unborn child, and rediscovered the small joys she had abandoned long ago. Yet at night, when the world grew quiet, she couldn't silence the memories. Steven's laughter during their early years, the way he had once held her hand as though it were the most precious thing in the world. The pain wasn't just from his cruelty. It was from the love that still stubbornly burned despite it. One evening, she sat with Daniel on the balcony, the city lights twinkling in the distance. "Do you believe people can change?" she asked suddenly. Daniel glanced at her, thoughtful. "I believe people change when the cost of staying the same becomes greater than the fear of becoming different." She considered that, her fingers tracing circles on her belly. "And what if it's too late?" "Then it's too late," Daniel said softly. "But sometimes it isn't." The unspoken question hung between them. Was Steven capable of change? Jennifer didn't have the answer, but her heart whispered a truth she couldn't ignore. She still hoped he was. Steven took his first fragile step. Late one night, he drove past Daniel's townhouse. He didn't stop. He didn't knock. He just sat in his car, staring at the warm glow spilling from the windows. He saw Jennifer's silhouette moving inside, her hand resting on her belly. His chest ached with longing, with regret so sharp it nearly doubled him over. For the first time in his life, Steven didn't see himself as the powerful man who could command anything. He saw himself as a boy, broken, frightened, desperate not to lose the only person who had ever truly loved him. And in that moment, he whispered a vow into the night. "I'll learn. I'll change. I'll be the man you need me to be." It wasn't a demand. It wasn't arrogance. It was a prayer, the first prayer of Steven Wright's life. Jennifer, inside, paused suddenly, as if sensing something. She glanced at the window, her heart tugging inexplicably. But when she looked out, the street was empty. She shook her head, telling herself it was just her imagination. Yet deep down, a flicker of something stirred. A fragile, dangerous hope that maybe, just maybe, her husband was beginning to understand what love truly meant. The next morning, Steven Wright did something no one had ever seen him do before. He walked into his office building, carrying 2 cups of coffee. One he handed to Clara. She froze mid-step, staring at him. "Is this?" "Black. No sugar." "The way you like it," Steven said awkwardly. Her eyebrows shot up. "Are you sick?" He almost snapped back but caught himself. Instead, he let out a sharp exhale. "No, I'm trying." Clara studied him for a long moment, then took the cup. "It's a start." For a man like Steven Wright, it was more than a start. It was the first crack in the wall he had built around himself for decades. Jennifer was folding freshly washed baby clothes, tiny onesies in soft pastel colors Daniel had helped her pick. When the knock came, her heart leapt before she even opened the door. Steven stood there, not in his tailored suits, not with his usual air of authority. He wore a simple shirt, sleeves rolled up, hair slightly disheveled. His eyes looked tired, but not from arrogance or late nights of business meetings. From humility. "Jennifer," he said softly. She froze, her hand gripping the doorframe. "Steven, what are you doing here?" He swallowed hard. His throat felt like sandpaper, but he forced the words out. "I came to listen." The phrase nearly knocked her off her feet. Daniel, sitting at the dining table inside, looked up. His gaze flicked between them. Then slowly, silently, he rose. "I'll give you 2 space," he said quietly, slipping past Steven with a subtle nod. For the first time, Steven didn't bristle at Daniel's presence. He didn't see him as competition, didn't see him as a threat. He saw him as the man who had protected his wife when he had failed, the man who had shown him without words what love was supposed to look like. Jennifer crossed her arms, her defenses rising. You left me in the rain, Steven. Pregnant. Alone. And now you just show up to say you want to listen. His shoulders sagged. I know words can't erase what I did, but I can't stand by and let my pride cost me everything. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need to try. Tears stung her eyes, but she forced herself to stay steady. Why now? Why not months ago, when I begged you to hear me? Because I was blind, he admitted, voice breaking. And then Daniel, he showed me, without even trying what I should have been all along. He cared for you not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Because that's what love is. Jennifer's chest tightened. The Steven she knew would never admit another man had taught him something. Yet here he was. For days, Steven returned. Not demanding entry. Not forcing conversation. Just showing up. Sometimes he brought groceries. Sometimes he fixed a creaky stair Daniel had been meaning to get to. Once he even stood outside in the pouring rain, waiting quietly until Jennifer finally let him in. It was strange, unsettling, and yet undeniably different. He was learning patience. He was learning humility. Jennifer tested him. She asked hard questions. She brought up painful memories. And for the first time, Steven didn't shout, didn't deflect, didn't try to buy his way out. He listened, truly listened. Daniel watched it all silently. One evening after Steven left, Jennifer found Daniel on the balcony. You're quiet, she said. He gave a faint smile. I've always been quiet. That's not what I mean, she pressed. Daniel looked out at the city. He's trying, Jennifer, and I think you still love him. Her breath caught. How do you know? Because when you look at him, your eyes soften, Daniel said gently. Not the way you look at me. Tears pricked her eyes. Daniel, you've been everything he wasn't, and I was glad to be, Daniel said simply. But I was never meant to take his place. Maybe I was just meant to remind you, and him, what love should feel like. Jennifer covered her mouth, emotions crashing through her like a storm. Daniel had never touched her beyond what was necessary. He had never spoken of love, never hinted at desire. His care had been pure, protective, selfless. And somehow, it was that selflessness that began to rebuild Steven. Steven, meanwhile, felt the change within himself. One afternoon, he stood in the nursery he had once mocked as unnecessary. Alone, he painted the walls a soft cream color. His expensive watch streaked with flecks of paint. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about appearances or control. He was thinking about Jennifer, about their child, about a future he wanted to earn, not command. When Jennifer saw the freshly painted room days later, she touched the wall with trembling fingers. You did this, she whispered. Steven nodded. For you, for us, if you let there be an us again. Her eyes filled with tears. She didn't answer. Not yet. But she didn't walk away either. And for Steven Wright, that silence was the greatest gift she could have given. The night was quiet, save for the ticking of the clock on Jennifer's wall. She had just settled into the couch when another knock sounded. This time she didn't hesitate. Steven stood there again, but there was something different about his face. His eyes looked hollow, as if he hadn't slept. Jennifer, he said softly, can I come in? Something in his voice tugged at her. She stepped aside without a word. He didn't bring groceries. He didn't come with flowers or empty promises. Instead, Steven carried a worn wooden box. He set it gently on the table, as if it weighed more than stone. What's that? Jennifer asked warily. My past, he whispered. With trembling hands, he opened the box. Inside were old photographs, most Jennifer had never seen. A boy with messy hair and bruises on his arms. A young man sleeping on a park bench. A tattered letter written in a woman's careful handwriting. Jennifer leaned closer, her chest tightening. Steven, what is this? My childhood, he said, voice breaking. The part one never let you see. The part one buried under money, success, and arrogance. He picked up the letter, holding it carefully like it might fall apart. This was for my mother. The last thing she ever wrote before she left me. She said she couldn't stay. That love wasn't enough to fix the man my father was. His throat closed, but he pushed on. So I learned early, love was weakness. Caring meant being abandoned. Vulnerability meant pain. I promised myself I would never feel that way again. Jennifer's hand shook as she touched the edge of the letter. Steven, I thought money would protect me, that control would keep me safe, that if I built walls high enough, no one could ever leave me again. But those walls kept you out. They hurt you. They nearly destroyed us. His shoulders slumped. Daniel, he showed me what I should have been, what love without fear looks like. And I hated him for it at first, because he revealed my failures. But now, I'm grateful, because he gave me a chance to see myself, and to change. Jennifer's eyes burned with tears. She had begged Steven for years to open up, to let her in, and now here he was raw and unguarded. Why are you showing me this now? She whispered. Because I can't ask you to forgive me unless you know the truth, Steven said, his voice trembling. I was never strong, Jennifer. I was terrified of losing you, of needing you too much. So I pushed you away before you could abandon me, just like my mother abandoned me. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with decades of pain unraveling between them. Jennifer reached for the photograph of the boy, with bruises. Her chest ached. This is you. Steven nodded, his jaw tightening. She brushed her thumb across the image, as if she could erase the pain imprinted there. All this time, I thought you didn't feel anything, that you didn't care. But the truth is you cared too much, didn't you? His eyes glistened. Yes, and I didn't know how to show it. For the first time in years, Jennifer saw not the millionaire, not the arrogant husband who had left her in the rain, but the broken boy who had never been taught how to love, and her heart softened. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks. Steven, all I ever wanted was for you to let me in. He took a shaky breath. I'm trying. I don't know if I'll ever be good at this, but I'll keep trying. Not for appearances, not to win, but for you, for our child, for us. Jennifer's hands trembled as she closed the wooden box. She placed her palm over his. That's all I ever asked. From the doorway, Daniel watched quietly. He hadn't meant to overhear, but he saw enough. Steven glanced up, meeting Daniel's eyes. For a moment, no words passed, just a silent exchange. Respect. Acknowledgement. Daniel gave a small nod, then stepped back into the shadows, leaving them to the fragile, healing silence that filled the room. Later that night, after Steven left, Jennifer sat alone, cradling her belly. She whispered softly to her unborn child, maybe your father is finally learning how to love, and maybe I can learn to forgive. Her words floated into the quiet room, a prayer, a promise, a hope. The call came just after midnight. Jennifer's voice was tight with urgency. Steven, it's time. Within minutes, Steven was at her door. No chauffeur, no flashy car, just him breathless, with keys in one hand and fear in the other. Jennifer clutched her belly, her face pale but determined. The baby. I've got you, Steven said firmly. And for the first time, Jennifer believed him. The drive to the hospital was a blur of rain-slick streets and whispered prayers. Steven's hand shook on the wheel, but he didn't let go. His eyes never left the road. His mind locked on one thought. Don't fail her. Not again. Daniel was there too, in the back seat, calm and steady. But unlike before, Steven didn't resent him. He was grateful. Grateful for the man who had stood guard when he hadn't. At the hospital doors, Steven lifted Jennifer into his arms without hesitation. She clung to him, her breath ragged. And in that moment, the millionaire who had once abandoned her in the rain was gone. In his place stood a husband, terrified, humbled, but fiercely present. Hours stretched into eternity. Jennifer's cries echoed through the sterile room. each one slicing through Steven's chest. He had faced hostile boardrooms, ruthless negotiations, and storms of scandal, but nothing had ever undone him like this. "Breathe, Jennifer," he whispered, holding her hand. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." Her nails dug into his skin, but he welcomed the pain. It was proof he was finally sharing her burden, not leaving her to carry it alone. At one point, Jennifer looked up at him through tears. "Steven, don't you dare leave me." He bent low, pressing his forehead to hers. "Never again. I swear it." When the wail of their newborn finally filled the room, Steven broke. Tears streamed down his face as he stared at the tiny life in the nurse's arms. A daughter. Their daughter. Jennifer, exhausted but glowing, reached out. Steven helped cradle the baby into her arms, his hand covering both of theirs. "She's perfect," Jennifer whispered. Steven's chest swelled with something he had never felt before. Not pride, not possession, but awe. Pure, humbling awe. Later, when Jennifer drifted into a much-needed rest, Steven slipped outside the hospital room. Daniel stood waiting, arms folded. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, Steven stepped forward. "Thank you." Daniel tilted his head. "For what?" "For saving her and I couldn't. For teaching me without saying a word. For being the man I should have been." Daniel's eyes softened. "You became that man, Steven. That's all that matters now." Steven's throat tightened. He extended his hand. Daniel shook it firmly. There was no rivalry in that gesture, no resentment, just respect. Days later, Jennifer sat in the nursery, the room Steven had painted himself. Their daughter, little Grace, slept peacefully in her crib. Steven entered quietly, carrying a cup of tea. "Careful," he said softly, placing it beside her. "It's not too hot." Jennifer looked at him, really looked. This was the same man who had once left her in the rain. Yes, but it was also the man who had carried her through hospital doors, who had held her hand through every contraction, who had finally opened his soul. "Steven," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why should I trust that this change will last?" He knelt before her, his hands covering hers. "Because I don't want to go back to who I was. Because I've seen what losing you looks like, and I never want to live that way again. And because I finally understand love isn't control. It's sacrifice." Tears filled her eyes. "And what if I can't forget the hurt?" "You don't have to forget," he said gently. "Just let me spend the rest of my life proving I've changed." The silence stretched, heavy and fragile. Then Jennifer exhaled, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I forgive you, Steven. Not because I've forgotten, but because I can see you've truly changed." His eyes burned. He pressed his forehead to hers, whispering, "Thank you." And in that moment, the walls he had built his whole life crumbled completely. Daniel visited one last time before stepping out of their lives. He held Grace briefly, a rare smile softening his face. "She's strong. She'll grow up knowing what real love looks like." Jennifer touched his arm. "You'll always be part of our story, Daniel. Thank you." He gave a quiet nod, then handed Grace back to Steven. "Take care of them," he said simply. "I will," Steven vowed. And Daniel left, the silent guardian who had taught by example, whose lesson had transformed a broken man into a loving husband and father. Weeks later, on a bright spring morning, Jennifer, Steven, and Grace walked through the park together. The same park where Jennifer had once sat alone in the rain, abandoned and heartbroken. But now her hand was in Steven's, his arm wrapped protectively around her, not out of control but out of love. Jennifer looked at him, her heart swelling. Steven caught her gaze and smiled softly. "Forever, Jennifer." She smiled back, whispering, "Forever." And as their daughter cooed softly between them, the Wright family began their new chapter, not built on pride or wealth, but on love, forgiveness, and the quiet lessons of a bodyguard who had shown them the way.